Just wanted to express my appreciation for our panelists who are sharing their evening with us on this very important topic. My name is Michelle Gates. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Garden Network. We were formerly the Vermont Community Garden Network. Technically, we still are with the IRS. We're going through a process of a name change, which does take a little bit of time. But because we work in so many different kinds of gardens, we thought it would be appropriate to broaden our title, be a little more inclusive, create some relevance outside of just rent plot gardens, which many people think community gardens are solely. And then I want to just do a couple little housekeeping. We are going to have each of our panelists present about 10 minutes of their expertise. We will pause. If you have questions for a particular panelist that come up during their discussion, you can put those into the chat. I will try to monitor that. I will monitor that. I won't try. I will do it. And we'll float those questions to the specific presenters. And then we'll move on to the next one. And then if you have questions that come up at any time, please continue to put them in the chat. We will have time after the first 45 minutes or so to address as many of those questions as we can. When you signed on, you should have gotten a notification that this was being recorded. And so we will have a link to this that we can send out to each of you after the presentation. And I think that's it. I'm going to now introduce our moderator, Joseph Kiefer, who is a food justice consultant who has advocated for and supported food access and equity through many programs and organizations over the years. He's been on our board for about 4 years now. He's currently serving as our vice president, and he has had a big role in helping put this panel together. Our programs committee suggested this, and we've been working on it for several months now because we think that this conversation is overdue and critical. So I will turn it over to Joseph, and I will continue monitoring behind the scenes here.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone. This is, as Michelle said, our first panel of a 3-part series. We want to acknowledge Fred Schmidt, who basically threw the idea out there, and we all thought that's a really good idea. So maybe we should do this. Maybe a moment to acknowledge the sacred land we all live on in the state that we now call Vermont, but the 12,000-year history of the Abenaki who have lived here and stewarded and cared for this land. And I think we continue to learn so much from their wisdom. Also worth a moment of silence for brothers and sisters fighting for their democratic freedom in Ukraine. So as I said, tonight is the first, but I want to also say a couple of words. Being on the Vermont Gardening Network board is an honor, and incredible work goes on here. I want to tip my hat to Michelle, who is, I've worked with a lot of executive directors in my 40-year career. She's one of the best, so it's great to work with her. I want to acknowledge Libby Whalen, the statewide network coordinator, Carolina Lukak, the garden education manager, Abby Haas, our membership coordinator, and Angela de Betancourt. She's the lead instructor at the Community Teaching Garden. A couple of quick things. If you don't know the Vermont Gardening Network, you should check the website out. A couple of programs that really jump out. One being the Gardening for Health program with the UVM Medical Center is a Food as Medicine initiative. Affordable housing gardening programs, getting a lot of people to grow some food who hadn't had much experience. Teaching Garden, a Fannie Allen Homestead, is a hands-on week-by-week course. Gardens for Learning is a summer program for at-risk children, at risk of hungers. And we just got a van, a mobile classroom that's going to be traveling all around the state. So that's a very exciting thing. A little bit about why we're doing this here. Clearly, it doesn't take long to realize, but just on Monday, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just released their latest report. I think it points to the severity of the world we're living in and the climatic conditions. And that's really what, we don't even have to look far to see the impacts of forest fires and flooding and extreme weather conditions. And that's probably what's going to be in store for all of us. So we thought, well, we should really start talking about it. And what is that going to mean for gardeners, farmers, people of all walks of life living in Vermont? The Vermont Climate Council report, it's a good start on the work we need to do. I think it points out two key themes that we'll be focusing on, resiliency and adaptation. So that's on the Vermont Farm to Plate Network. I know when I got involved in food and hunger issues in the 80s, the early 80s, we started looking at just kind of wondering, well, how much food are we growing in Vermont? And over the years, we've realized not a lot. We're importing most of our food. So Vermont Farm to Plate initiative is now in its 11th year. Took a long, hard look and say, how do we grow more farms, more farmers, more food processing? How do we grow? How do we rebuild our food system so we can start feeding ourselves again? And I think one of the goals of the Vermont Garden Network is, in fact, learning how to feed ourselves again, teaching those age-old skills. I think the pandemic, I'm on a board of a local food shelf in Montpelier, and the pandemic has probably taught us all more than we wanted to know. I know one thing it's taught is a lot of people who thought they may have been food secure went to the store and there wasn't things that they thought would be there. And they had to start looking around and realized their life has changed too. And they started reaching out to local farms and farmers to access food that normally was maybe in that chain store. So I think there became a huge wake-up call for food security. And it really feels like we're all in this new curriculum, the new classroom of relocalizing our lives and learning how to live where we are. As Michelle said, our format for tonight will be each of our presenters will have 10 minutes. I know that's hard. It's really hard to take a life's worth of work and say 10 minutes, and we'll do our best to try to keep you at 10. And then people will send their questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to get questions out for the last half hour of our day. As Michelle said, we are taping this. I know we have a high school teacher who's asked if she can use this with her students. So I think this conversation is going to ripple out there a little bit. Our panelists for tonight, we have Sam Bliss from UVM. He's a PhD candidate in natural resources. He's going to talk about how food self-provisioning interacts with food security and health, how gardening contributes to food security among Vermonters today, and how that could change in a hotter future. We have Meg Fuerst from South Royalton Community Garden. We'll be talking about communal gardening in the face of global catastrophes, growing food for resilience, unique impacts for the LGBTQ and BIPOC and neurodivergent gardeners. Karen Ganey, a facilitator with the Change the World Kids, educator and site lead for Regeneration Core, and founder of Permaculture Solutions. We'll focus on equity, vulnerabilities in the food system, and solutions to building more resilience, preparing kids for a better future. Finally, David Zuckerman, former Lieutenant Governor of Vermont, state senator and state representative, and co-owner of the Full Moon Farm. He'll be talking about a perspective of scale, solutions to efficiencies, communal growth, crop rotations, community food storage, cultural knowledge for better food security, empowerment, and social benefits. So again, thank you all for coming tonight and being here wherever you are. And we're going to begin with Sam Bliss.
Thanks, Joseph. And thanks to Michelle and everyone at Vermont Garden Network for organizing this and inviting me to participate. I'm going to share a few slides. Someone give me a thumbs up if that's working. Wonderful. Magic. Okay. So going to be talking about food security in Vermont through the pandemic and how gardening interacts with food security, and then look forward toward future where climate change gets more intense, more severe. But first, where are we at right now? Before COVID, so before March 2020, according to a survey that was done a year into COVID, a little less than a quarter of Vermont households were experiencing food insecurity, and other numbers show that even fewer were experiencing food insecurity. At the height of COVID, about a third of Vermont households were experiencing food insecurity. And in spring 2021, and we're redoing this survey right now. So this is a 1-year-old data, and it's from a project that I'm participating in with the NFAC, the National Food Access and COVID Research Team, the chapter here at University of Vermont that I'm part of. So now food security and food insecurity in Vermont is about a quarter of households. But what does that mean? What is food security? Well, food security is measured by questionnaires, and there's some validated, very short questionnaires that ask questions like, did you skip meals or cut meal size in the last month because there wasn't enough money for food? Or did you eat less than you felt you should because there wasn't enough money for food? Did the food in your household not last and there wasn't enough money to get more? Were you unable to afford to eat a balanced meal? Were you ever hungry but didn't eat because you couldn't, because there wasn't enough money for food? And so you'll notice the thing that unites all these questions is that they're premised on the assumption that money is the unique key to unlock the food door. The way people get food is that they buy it. And so these questions that are used to measure food security are actually pretty useless when the question is, how does gardening interact with food security? Because when you're producing your own food, when you're growing your own food, when you're collecting wild food from nature, when you're getting food from the charitable food system, you're not paying for it. And so our measures for food security and for food insecurity are basically measuring the inability or ability to purchase food. So kind of keep that in mind as we're talking about how gardening and food insecurity are related. So what I study is non-market food practices in Vermont. That's what I'm doing my PhD in. So that includes food self-provisioning, so growing your own food, raising your own livestock, getting food from your environments in different ways, foraging, hunting, fishing. And then also the ways that people get food, or people exchange food and transfer food, distribute food other than buying and selling. So sharing, barter, charity, solidarity. So all the things that aren't covered really in the food security definition, the way that it's measured scientifically. So one thing that's hard about studying this is there's not data. Nobody really writes things down about their gardening, fishing, foraging, hunting. Like a lot of the economic data that we have about food is from the commercial food system. And so it's been really hard to know just what are the extent of practices like gardening in Vermont. And so see here, with Vermont Sustainable Job Fund, we've been putting questions on the Vermonter poll, which is a yearly survey of Vermonters that happens in February, about what is the prevalence of participation in these different practices where people might be getting some of their food. So if you look at growing your own food, gardening, in 2020, it looked like about 3/4 of Vermonters were gardening. And in 2021, that was down to 2/3. Now, this is in February, so the 2021 was done as a phone survey with a bunch of students calling people up, doing numbers in the phone book, seeing who responds. And in 2021 February, it was the pre-vaccination pandemic. A phone survey was impossible, and it was a web survey. And so what we know from other research is that more people grew their own food, more people bought hunting and fishing licenses, more people were getting food in a lot of these ways other than purchasing it during the pandemic. But the data, just because of the way that the survey was conducted, from a phone survey to an internet survey during the pandemic, shows the opposite. And so this is just sort of the grain of salt that I encourage us to look through when we're looking at survey-based data. Like, it's all imperfect science, and this is the best we can do. So Is it 3/4 or is it 2/3 of Vermont households that garden? Well, this other survey from the NFACS team that I'm part of did last spring found that about half of Vermont households garden, another web survey. So is it 3/4, 2/3, 1/2? I don't know, but I think the other things that these surveys find are still useful as long as we take them with that grain of salt. So what's shown here is the prevalence in gardening and some of these other food self-provisioning practices among households that are food secure and households that are food insecure. And so for all of the practices except for gardening, are more prevalent among food insecure households. Gardening is about the same, 51 and 54%. It's not a significant difference. And so you might think, oh, well, what does that mean? Does that mean these practices are bad for food security? No, what it's showing is, remember, the measures of food security are about if you have enough money for food. What it's showing is that fishing, foraging, hunting, having your own livestock are something people are using as coping mechanisms or like a safety net when they don't have enough money to buy food, especially in rural areas. Now, gardening, sort of the classic understanding is that it's either like a hobby or leisure activity for well-off people or a coping mechanism for poor people. And I think what's going on with gardening, as we know, because we're all gardeners here, is a lot more complicated than that. Like what we get from gardening is a lot more than food or leisure. However, these data seem to sort of underscore just that. So, next slide. In that same research, you can see we asked people what, by your reckoning, what percentage of your vegetables come from all these different sources. Again, you see that people who are food insecure, don't have enough money to buy food, predictably get their food from or get their vegetables from a larger variety of sources. Again, this is from the survey where 50% of households reported growing some of their own food, not 60 or 70% did. So the percentages that of people's vegetables that they get from their gardens might be higher if we did the research differently. So my role in all this was I conducted the key informant interviews, which is I talked to a bunch of homesteaders and gardening educators and folks who work in the charitable food system, like with Vermont Food Bank, people who work with fish and wildlife, and asked them about the parts of this story about producing your own food and food security and health that the survey couldn't bring out. And so how does gardening interact with food security? Well, most people just said, yeah, gardening's great for food security. It's hunting, fishing, foraging, they're great for food security. These are ways to get food. Like, how could they not be good for food security? But one thing that came up, and from an economic point of view holds a lot of water, is that there's opportunity costs. Like, you could get more food in your hours of work getting a $13 an hour job in the service sector and then going to shop at Hannaford or Price Chopper than you would get spending those same amount of hours in your garden. There's actually, like, in that sense, one might argue that gardening is bad for food security. But what's going on here? Why is it that people are just saying gardening is good for food security if from a purely economic point of view, it might not be? Well, for some people, the financial savings do work out. It provides food they wouldn't otherwise afford. They can save money in a way that allows them to improve their overall financial situation. People in rural areas often have more time and land than money or access to jobs. There's also the proximity or ease of access. You have fresh veggies right outside. You don't have to go anywhere, and that makes a big difference if you're in a rural area. Also, people get the food that they want in the garden. Folks who are, for immigrants, for example, the foods that they want aren't always sold in stores in Vermont, but also people who, and everybody can benefit from having control over the varieties they're growing and having them available right out the door. Now, the other thing, and I think this is where we're starting to get into like thinking about in a changing climate, is that gardening makes a big difference in the stability of people's food access. So in one sense, it's the like seasonal stability. If you freeze, ferment other methods of food preservation. But also people talked about gardening and food security, not in the way of like, did you have enough money for food in the past month? You know, when I ask people about food security, they're not thinking about like any official like survey definition of food security. They're thinking, do I feel secure in my food sources? And for a lot of people, it's like, well, there was the beginning of COVID when there was no toilet paper on the shelves and no hand sanitizer on the shelves. And we were all worried about if food is next. And I know I have this set of skills that I can grow my own food. And I feel more food secure because of that. I have a garden already. And I'm not going to read these quotes from folks that I interviewed, but you can read them as I talk about other stuff, hopefully slowly enough to give you a second. But you know, there were big increases in gardening during the pandemic, partly because people had more time if they had disruptions to their jobs, but also because people were worried about the food supply. And now, in the aftermath, food prices are going up. Right now, there's big inflation. There's also supply chain issues that folks are worried about. And so we might see, because of those things, the uptick in gardening and food self-provisioning be maintained or even increase now. So other panelists will probably talk about how climate change is making gardening harder because of things like more erratic precipitation. But I will say that gardening is key to resilience or maintaining food security in an unstable future if we can make it work in the less stable climate conditions that are coming. So when thinking specifically about climate breakdown and how that interacts with food security, folks who I talk to are super concerned. Oops, what did I do? Super concerned about, you know, a future where food supply is going to be less certain, and being able to grow our own food makes a huge difference there. But I would say it's also it's not just the adaptation, but also the mitigation. It's if you're converting lawn to garden, if you're growing low input vegetables near your home instead of from high input farming far away, you're making a big difference in carbon emissions too. So not just preparing for the climate change future by knowing how to grow your own food, having those institutions to share food, but also making a big difference in slowing down climate change through gardening. And like the latest IPCC report that Joseph was mentioning, it's dry scientific language, but really it says that like a profit-oriented market economy designed to just grow forever, you know, capitalism probably doesn't have what it takes to prevent catastrophic warming. And so things like gardening, things like these non-market ways of getting food are something of an alternative. And in Vermont, there's these still living traditions of producing our own food and exchanging it in community at a local scale. And when you combine that with young people coming to Vermont who grew up in the suburbs and are maybe disillusioned and want to learn these traditions, and then also some preliminary efforts to revive the indigenous foodways here that settlers destroyed, I think in Vermont we might be able to be something of a model for how to feed ourselves differently in a climate change future. And I would argue that gardening isn't just a token part of that. Gardening, got a couple more lines. Gardening builds this like the sorts of deep relationships we need, like relationships with each other and our environments, and relationships based on care. So yeah, thanks. Sorry if I went a little over.
Meg.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Sam, for that. that's a nice segue into what I was going to talk about, because we at the community garden are really one of those non-market food gardening practices. So hi everyone, my name is Meg Fuerst and I am a co-manager of the South Welton Community Garden in Central Vermont. And I'm going to focus my comments primarily around the questions of how do we localize our food system and how do we address equity gaps while we're doing that. So I do want to say right up front that the South Welton Community Garden, we are a registered climate victory garden under Green America. That means that all of our practices are inherently climate friendly gardening practices. We don't use any machines that use fossil fuels. We do everything with people power. We do rotational planting. So we rotate what crops go in what plots. We do composting, of course, cover cropping for the winter, and all of that. So we identify as a climate victory garden, which actually stems from after World War II. The government set up victory gardens for communities to feed themselves when facing serious supply chain shortages from World War II. And so there's a movement to reestablish victory gardens, but instead of it being a World War catastrophe, in order to prepare for the climate catastrophe. So that's something we take really seriously at the community garden. And so when I talk about growing food, although I'm going to focus more on the social and equity issues here, when I talk about growing food together, it's always in the context of growing food in a really climate friendly manner. So, we don't use any synthetic fertilizers or GMO seeds or anything like that. So I was part of a 3-person team that took over management of the South Welton Community Garden in 2018, specifically with the mission to grow an interconnected, vibrant, and healthy community through individual and communal gardening. And our community garden is a little bit unique because in addition to renting out private plots, which is sort of the more traditional model of community gardens, we also have what we call an open space, where inexperienced and experienced people alike can come together and garden and socialize. So the open space is really an invitation for absolutely anyone to engage in the management of the community garden. People can show up as often or as little as they'd like in a growing season, help out for the time that they're there, and take home a share of the harvest. So there are many people, particularly historically disadvantaged or underserved folks, who want to grow their own food but don't have access to land. Community gardens in general are really great about providing access to land, but if you're following that traditional model of only renting out private plots, that still comes with a lot of significant barriers to participate. So, buying all of your own seeds and equipment and materials like compost and cover crops, row covers. And oftentimes community gardens have waiting lists. So, what's special about having an open space is, first, there's no waiting lists because there's no maximum capacity for who all can participate in the space. But more importantly, we provide everything that a gardener needs to be successful. So we're fortunate to have a lot of support in our community from both local organizations and businesses. We have a lot of support in our small little town. And so we kind of piecemeal together all the support we can get in order to cover our costs and provide for the community. So, we provide all of the seeds, all the compost we get donated by local horse farms. We have a tool shed with all of the tools and equipment that any of our gardeners need, whether they're open space volunteers or individuals who are renting out a private plot. We provide all of that. It's part of the community resource. And what we've experienced is once everything you need is provided at no cost, participation in communal gardening can really blossom. And I want to emphasize also what Sam said, after the pandemic hit, we experienced a huge increase in the number of people coming to participate in the community garden. And so, I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone that, in the face of a global catastrophe, people really, people's survival instincts sort of kick in, and our survival instincts as humans tell us that we need access to food. And when we see such significant supply chain disruptions like what we saw in the pandemic, and all of a sudden food's not being available in the stores, or you hear about California where like all of our food comes from, and one disruption there can lead to mass food shortages. People's survival instincts kick in, and we saw just a huge influx of folks coming to Godin at the community garden for a variety of reasons. And so in terms of equity, removing those costs and access barriers is absolutely key in building resilience in our food systems, because we do not have local food resilience if anyone is being left out. So it's really important to make sure that it's a really inclusive effort. And so addressing issues of equity doesn't stop at just providing everything that people need to be successful. I want to kind of run through some of the ways that we've been able to be successful in attracting a really diverse group of gardeners at the South Welton Community Garden. So despite not being a particularly diverse community, we have a lot of gardeners who are members of the LGBTQ plus community, myself included. We have BIPOC gardeners, both Black Vermonters and gardeners who are new to Vermont from places like Venezuela. We have autistic gardeners, and we also have older people in the garden that we call the garden elders out of respect. And so we have a lot of generational and as well as demographic diversity. And so things that allow for that, first being that the management team that started the open space, all of us fall into one of those categories of people. The program was stood up by my former partner, Caroline, and I, as well as a woman in our community who's autistic. And we have heard from our BIPOC gardeners that, they've been too intimidated to even approach a community garden space in Vermont, in some other towns. And just having this garden be managed by, gay women and was really welcoming and made them feel safe enough to even approach the space. So I know that can be a tricky point because, community garden should be started and led by absolutely anyone, but there is something to be said for intentionally channeling resources to garden programs that are established or currently led by BIPOC, LGBTQ, neurodivergent folks, because just having it be under that sort of leadership allows other people who have been historically underserved to feel safe entering that space. There is, while these groups are certainly not monolithic, there is a sense of solidarity among people who kind of fall outside of that scope of what society has deemed a normal human. So channeling resources to that sort of leadership. The other main reason goes back to eliminating that individual burden. So Sam also mentioned this, at the community garden, we operate in a strictly mutual aid manner, and that's actually embedded in our contract. So people with private plots do sign a contract to participate, and it's embedded in the contract that we garden following mutual aid. And what that means is that if people with private plots, if they go out of town for a little while and need help keeping their plot maintained, we offer those services. So open space volunteers are often helping to weed and harvest from private plots, and individuals who have private plots are often helping us in the open space on big project days. And everyone just steps up to help everyone else complete their projects and do what they want to do. So we're really intentional about not letting gardening become too overwhelming for any one individual, because we have the people power to share that workload and share the responsibility, which means that someone can go out of town. You know, someone can be sick for 2 weeks and not have to worry about their plot being overrun and crops going to waste, because we have this mutual aid system in place. And that's really important for getting everyone involved, because gardening can be burdensome. It does require capital. It requires time, land, equipment. It requires a lot of things that not everyone has. And the more we can ease the individual burden on people to garden, the more gardening will happen at a community scale. And on that front, you know, on the mutual aid front, we really are a grassroots effort. And that also helps get at the equity piece of building resiliency in our communities. The community garden, the South Welton Community Garden, is not any sort of formal entity. It's not a nonprofit. It's not even a town committee. It's really just a group of us doing this. And so it's a really grassroots effort, and that helps. It does present some challenges, especially in terms of funding, but it actually really helps us to welcome anyone that shows up to the garden. There's no sign-ins. We don't collect anyone's personal information. There's no membership. You know, there's really no strings attached to coming and participating and accessing the food that's grown there. And that is not always possible with certainly not possible with industrial systems and for-profit systems, but it's also even not possible oftentimes with nonprofit organizations and the nonprofit complex. So it actually helps us to stay really grassroots in being as inclusive as we can. And we also try to remain as non-hierarchical as possible, despite there being a management team. And then I do want to just focus a little bit before my time's up on the elders in our community garden, because that's a group that's often invisible when we talk about equity and building local community resilience. But we do have an elder, and the community garden is in walking distance of the local residential senior living home in town. And we have an elder who has her own private plot, and she lives in that residential home. And she's growing her food in her private plot to share with all the other elders that live in that senior living home. So I just want to highlight that as, you know, having this community resource where we're all growing food together, be within walking distance of places where vulnerable people live, like older Vermonters, is also important for improving that access and equity. So she can just walk. She doesn't need to drive her car to a garden space. So I'll just end by saying that, you know, mitigating the climate emergency means to prepare for systems collapse, and preparing for systems collapse means to transition to entirely new systems. We're a little bit radical at the community garden. We do not believe that we will achieve the bold action that's necessary by trying to remain in the same systems that caused the extremely problematic reality we live in and improving those, but rather from completely diverting ourselves from those systems and saying, hey, we're a community, we have land here in our community, let's grow food with and for each other in a way that's separate from, in a way that really establishes a strong local food system that is insulated from these global catastrophes that are going to become more and more common as the climate catastrophe worsens. And so, you know, we aim to prepare for true systems collapse by engaging collectively towards an increasingly self-sufficient food supply chain within our own community. Let's see, I had one more last thought here. Yeah, and so I just wanted to say, you know, we also donate food to the food shelf in order to keep that food cycling to our community. And so I think the South Welton Community Garden can be a model for how a really small space can actually have a huge impact in terms of building local food resiliency and preparing for the climate catastrophe. Joseph, I think you're on mute.
Am I muted now? Yeah.
Wait, you came off and then muted again. You are muted now.
You can hold your space bar down and try talking.
Okay, that's a great thing.
There you go. We can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Meg. That was wonderful. Next up is Karen. Karen Ganey.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Ganey, and thank you so much for that, Meg. It's really inspiring and super refreshing to be able to talk about these issues in an honest way. We face them together, and I think that we can really work on, living into a lot of the solutions together as well. And especially coming off of a couple of years of a pandemic, I think, dealing with some of these complex problems that relate to systems collapse, it really helps to be able to come together as communities. So all the gratitude to the Vermont Community Garden Network for pulling us together this evening and being able to discuss these things. And I also want to acknowledge Fred. I see some great comments in the chat, and we will, I think, be getting into a little bit more of growing for climate change in mind and certain strategies for mitigation as well. There's obviously a lot to be talked about in these panels. So I'm going to go ahead. I just have a couple of short just slides with some pictures that I'm going to share to tell the story about my work and some of the things that I do. So I'm very fortunate to be the facilitator of a local group called, oops, not that one, just a sec, sorry. A local group called Change the World Kids. And there's a youth-run nonprofit. It's based out of Woodstock, but we actually just started a chapter in the South Welton, Sharon area. And Meg and the community garden folks have been incredible at welcoming us and teaching us how to plant some seeds there and just establishing community connections to really round out that intergenerational community that Meg was talking about. So connecting youth to elders and activists of all walks and all backgrounds. So it's been a great space for that. So based in Woodstock, part of the work that we do is really rooted in food justice. And, we really live into this and try to, create a world where no one in our community goes hungry and everyone has access to clean, healthy, organic, and culturally appropriate foods. And that's basically how we broadly define food security. And we have about a quarter of an acre of a food garden that is located in Pomfret. The Artistry Center there gives us a plot that we grow food in, that we deliver 100% to the local food shelf. And that serves about 5 different towns in the local area, much further beyond Woodstock, out into Bridgewater, Killington, Plymouth, then Pomfret, North Pomfret, and other areas around there. And so we're the only provider of 100% organic food to the local food shelf. And over the years, we've also built a root cellar at the local elementary school. So where we store, root crops, through the winter months and are able to maintain our deliveries to the food shelf basically year round. We only miss out on about a month and a half of deliveries. So this really relates to this topic of food security is, reducing, of course, our dependence on foods that come from, hundreds of miles away. So by connecting this also with kids, we're giving them a chance to really be a part of the solutions and learn some of these skills, around food growing and preservation in the form of storage and also making food, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So just last year, we also completed a food justice activity booklet. So this is really geared for the young ones to just start introducing concepts of equity and how, everyone deserves access to free and culturally appropriate foods. And, there's all kinds of fun games and activities about getting the food to many different markets, not just the food shelf, but also the schools or community groups or other places that might benefit from some of the food that's grown. And we really kind of work in a model in such a way that we are, recycling the abundance. So we talk about and work with concepts of responsibility and reciprocity, and believe that in seeding these ideas in action that relates to our food system, we can really help to plant those seeds that even Meg was talking about in terms of how are we going to continue to grow, strong community food networks. So yeah, some pictures. We've got, all kinds of everywhere from freshmen to seniors, actually some 8th graders engaging in our garden. We also have a Change the World Kids Rising program where we plant the garden in the spring with a group of elementary kids. So we're always trying to kind of encourage participation. So growing food security is one thing, of course, storing, like I said, is another. So this is the picture on the left is a group of students. We're taking food out of the root cellar and then bringing it to the food shelf, which is the picture on the right. And this is what we kind of believe food security looks like, is being able to grow, store, and also have decision-making power around where that food is going, recycling the abundance to the people that are most vulnerable in our communities, often, marginalized communities like elders, BIPOC individuals. And I could talk about how we're doing that and how we're kind of building relationships with different populations to be able to really create a food network that is well supported. And yeah, there's a lot to it, but this is basically just some of the beautiful, fun images. So one part of the what we work in food recovery is partnering with Willing Hands, which receives large donations of foods from distributors. Of course, I'm sure a lot of you know about the incredible work that they do. And we've become a recipient site for a project that we do during the winter months called the Soup Kit Project. And so we basically take between 200 and 500 pounds of food from Willing Hands a week and turn it into soup. And so we work with a volunteer chef and a community kitchen at the local UU church. And we make between 65 and 80 quarts of soup a week that again then gets distributed to the food shelf again, but then 5 other communities that we partner with the Ottaquechee Health Center to then go around and actually distribute the soup to different homes. So all in turn, we're kind of building relationships and really trying to kind of neutralize a platform in such a way that says, everyone, this food is for everyone. Everyone can have access to it if they so choose. And, we're not the ones that are defining the need. We're just trying to provide the need, if you will. And so yeah, the Soup Kit Project has been great. And we also see this to be a really important part of building local food resilience in our bioregion, is just really utilizing what would otherwise be going into waste streams. Fortunately, we're composting a lot of in our garden and in our food recovery program, and we're still getting there as a state. But on the industrial food scale, we have a lot of work to do in terms of food recovery. So this is often what it looks like, and I often say it's not always pretty. There's times where we're like carrying 50 to 75 pound bags of food, 2 and 3, 4, 4 different places, in and out of cars and out of kitchens in different forms, and raw vegetables, and then in made soups. And this is what the grassroots effort really looks like, is, when there's food that is going to go to waste, how can we then produce it and value add it and get it to people in need? And again, like recycling that food into that abundance into places where it is needed most. So I love this image. I have so many pictures of I'm sure we all have these little moments in our lives and our days that we go, okay, this is like really what I'm here for. This is why I'm here. And because I've got the gardening stuff, we're growing the food, but we're also transporting it in those little gophers like all around the Upper Valley. So and I also want to just kind of stress that too. It can also be very fun and joyful process. Like while we're faced with this daunting and kind of unfathomable idea of what collapse could mean, we know that like that system that we think of as normal hasn't worked for so many for so long, or the actually living systems that we depend on. So there can be a lot of joy in finding solutions in the process of food recovery and climate gardening as a way to be modeling something that we could be doing so much better, that really, I believe, is our birthright, to be reconnecting with natural systems in the ways that we are when we're so intimately connected to our food and each other. So I invite us to kind of find those places of joy and bring that into it as much as we can, so we can be creating from those places, because it's certainly a beautiful thing to be harvesting food and then making it together in these beautiful colors and then sharing it with people. And we've gotten to see a tremendous amount of community connection and gratitude and real relationships being built in the process of sharing and distributing food throughout the community. And more so importantly, that, you know, where I am doing this work now is really for the youth and for them to get involved with this and get a chance to be a part of developing some of these skills. Yeah, more food recovery. You have pictures upon pictures of looks like that. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. Of just, you know, cutting, chopping, prepping, and this is just what it looks like. I think when we're talking about climate gardening, it's not just growing food. And I think there's a great comment in the questions around how can we just get more people to grow food? And as a permaculturist and someone that really is guided by the natural systems, there's so much abundance. And as we all know from the zucchini season, where we have to lock our doors or we're going to get, you know, baseball bat size zucchinis on our seats, or you know, if there's modeling that and recycling that and like taking away the stigma associated with any kind of sense of lack, I think is a part of what we're really up to in these times. So yeah, an intergenerational connection. So connecting youth to elders. This is on the left here, Ken Woodhead. He's our 77-year-old volunteer chef with 45 years of experience in, you know, and as a restaurant owner. So some of the kids that work in our program really get to work with experienced people that where they have a true heart and passion for the work that they do. So yeah, we can't talk about kind of climate gardening and food recovery and food justice without talking about composting, you know, and just like really closing closed loop cycles. We know that there's a tremendous amount of carbon drawdown from just enacting compost. Of course, we're now as a state mandated to be composting. And so learning about these cycles and really recovering, you know, food out of the waste stream and adding it to our local fertility in the form of soil is where we got to be. So bringing youth into that process and giving other people an opportunity to kind of not just, you know, it's great that we're going to be composting as a state. And I think it's going to have wonderful impacts in the long term as far as climate mitigation. But we still want to be careful of this, you know, put your food waste in a bucket and send it off with Casella somewhere, and recognize just like the purpose and connection of being a part of those cycles and getting to see something that go from an apple core to a, you know, beautiful micro, you know, really biological rich soil. I think it's a process that can really help to build our sense of quality of character and, you know, give us the oomph that we need to be building new systems in times of transition. And so none of this really happens without community collaboration. And I think I work with a dear friend, Kat Buxton, a lot, and we're always talking about building the social mycelium. And I'm sure a lot of you on this call are doing that in the many and varied ways that you are. I know you are. And so I think as we really move towards a future where we need to establish systems where, you know, food security is community security, and find ways that we can create these hubs of connectivity where there's food growing together with food processing, food distribution, and then food recycling, really feels to be part of the essential components of a resilient culture. So I could talk a lot more about climate growing strategies and permaculture and design, and I hope you have lots of good questions for us so that we can dive into some of those methodologies as well. So
Thanks,
thank
Karen.
you.
We do have a couple questions, but I think I'm going to wait till the end and try to sort them a little bit. We might not have time to get to them all, but there's been a few that have popped up since you've been talking.
Okay, and I think it would be great, we can share contacts and resources so that as questions, and even in the awkward format of Zoom, we can still stay connected and with, you know, questions and conversations in the future.
Oh, well, that's awesome. You just answered one of my questions right there.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure Joseph was going to cover it too as a moderator. But anyway, thank you all so much, and I look forward to hearing more of your voices as well.
Thank you, Karen. Am I back? Am I here? David's up next. David?
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Michelle and Fred, for organizing this. And I'm really honored to be with these other speakers because honestly, I'm not a community gardener. I don't study community gardening, and I'm super psyched to hear about the work that's happening out there. And really, when I farmed in the Intervale, I always was going by the community gardens down there, and turns out that the person I married happened to be someone who had a couple plots in that community garden. So that worked out well. So you never know, community gardens, you can find your love as well. Not just the soil and the food, but the species person. I tend to wing it a little bit. I don't have a slideshow presentation. I've been farming for 12 hours already today, 13 hours. So I don't often have as much time to prepare as I would like. But I want to tell a little story about just food and food insecurity for a minute. At the beginning of the pandemic, March of 2020, never mind that I had started a political campaign that was doomed to fail because of the pandemic. We'll just gloss over that for a minute. But we, on our farm, we grow about 20 to 25 acres of produce a year, do between 1,000 and 1,500 chickens. We raise and sell 80 to 120 piglets a year, and we raise maybe another 30 or 40 hogs for meat each year. And in early November, I would say we have the most food in storage at any time of the year. You know, we've brought in all the big fall crops, cabbages and potatoes and sweet potatoes and onions and carrots and beets and other things. And we probably have between 100 to 140,000 pounds of food. And that feels like a big number. If I was better prepared, I would have sent a picture of our coolers. It's just these massive bins full of food. It's a beautiful sight. And in March, when the pandemic started, we probably had 20 or 25,000 pounds of food still left from what we had been distributing all winter. And in just a week or two, it was gone. And it got me thinking about our food system and food insecurity and just food security for everybody, frankly. Because if you remember, the store shelves were emptying. People were wondering about toilet paper, but they're also wondering about food. And I got thinking about it. And according to the Farm to Plate, Farm Fresh Network report, our farm is probably in the top 5%, 5 or 6% in terms of scale of vegetable farm in the state, diversified farm. And at our peak of storage, early November, we had less than 1 pound of food for every resident of Chittenden County for one day. So we might think a lot of us are food secure and aren't necessarily thinking about food insecurity from a day-to-day basis. But when you think about the system collapse that Meg referenced, and you think about the potential, whether it's global political instability, which is often brought on, frankly, by climate issues. We can get into that whole conversation, but it's tangent. We honestly are so food insecure as a state from a perspective of self-reliance and resilience that we could just start right there, whether it's community gardens or larger farms like my own. And I'll say our CSA that next year, we had more members than we've ever had. And a year later, once the store shelves are full again, a lot of that dropped back off. And it got me thinking about a phrase, a catchphrase that I should probably trademark, but I won't, and you can all use it. It was buy local now so you'll have local later. And now with it being the community garden discussion, I would say eat local now so that you can eat local later, because it doesn't necessarily have to be what you're buying. It can be what you're growing yourself in your garden or your community garden. But honestly, we need, hundreds more community gardens. We need so much more space made available for people that don't have access. Or here in Chittenden County, where I'm 25 minutes from downtown Burlington, half an hour, there isn't the land area in the proximity. There's the Intervale. So there is some land area, certainly in proximity to a lot of people, but our food system needs lots of different overhauls, and community gardens is a big piece of that. I will say that one of the things that gives me most pleasure as a CSA farmer is when one of my members emails this time of year and says, you know, we're not going to be a member again because we're starting our own gardening in our backyard. And most people would say, oh my God, that's terrible for your business. That's awful. I'm like, hallelujah. You went from being a grocery store buyer to being a CSA member to seeing how good local and fresh and, you know, picked right food can be. And now you're going to try it on your own. That's exciting to me. Now, usually within a couple of years, they're back because they go, holy smokes, that was so much harder than I thought it was going to be. And or I don't have enough sun, or I couldn't grow this crop or that. But I'm still so excited when they start realizing how good food can be. The other thing is when people at the farmer's market say to me, I don't know what you do. What kind of plastic bags do you have? Which we do, unfortunately, still go through some plastic produce bags, but thankfully far fewer. So many more people are bringing their own bags. That's exciting. One customer of mine about 10 years ago said, there's something about the bags you use because your food lasts so long. Your food tastes so good. And it's hard because there's so many other people around. I don't really want to embarrass someone when they say that, but I point out that our commercial industrial food is often picked so underripe or so, not ready to be picked or traveled so far that it's already aged, that its flavor and its nutrition are not at the same levels. And I'm going to get into the climate crisis part, which is really the key of this in half a moment, which is to say that I think in some ways, as a larger farm, I'm probably more vulnerable to climate change than a community garden. Because if there's a pest problem, for me, it's a bigger scale problem. It's hard to just squeeze them all by hand, you know, where you could sometimes do that on the community gardening. Thank you, Katie. And or if there's water issues, I can't carry buckets of water and water 20 acres of vegetables. I'm pumping water out of a pond with a tractor that's fossil fuel run. And so if we either have an energy shortage and I can't pump the water, or awesome, Meg, or I run out of water, which last year it was dry in the spring. I don't know if many people remember that, but by late June, my pond was almost empty. And I thought, I'm not even into July and August when it's the hottest and often the most sapping because the plants are bigger, they're transpiring more. So I think community gardening and local food production is a huge piece of what's necessary, but it's going to be hard. You know, if we have spells of intense dry weather, I would say one of the impacts of the climate changing is, I remember as a kid, we used to get long, gentle rains for a whole day, which maybe tomorrow we're going to get a long rain. I don't know how gentle it'll be. But now we get these short bursts of downpours. Those are much more challenging from a farming perspective or a gardening perspective, whether it's pounding the seedlings or whether it's the runoff and the water just doesn't even soak in. So adapting takes a lot of things. We're putting up more and more high tunnels. Well, that's metal and plastic. We're actually using more resources to try to adapt to the challenge. And so it's this counterintuitive, maybe not even the right thing to do. I don't even know that we know. But under a high tunnel, you can protect the plants from that downpour, but then you've got to actively water the plants. And so there's a lot of I think benefits to the smaller scale of community gardens, since that's the focus of community gardens in climate crisis, more than the 20-acre larger producer. I will say that some of the impacts of climate, we're finding that some of the summer pests are arriving earlier, because what happens if the ground doesn't freeze as cold or as far south, then the pests that used to die, say all the way to North Carolina, and then in the spring they had to work their way up back to Vermont. Maybe now it only freezes down to central Pennsylvania. And so some of those pests are here earlier. Or we have new pests like Swede midge in the last 5 or 8 years. Very frustrating. I used to grow an acre or two of broccoli. Now I do about half an acre because I have to rotate it farther from where it was the year before in order not to have Swede midge. I have no idea how I'm almost at 10 minutes, 20 seconds more. So I'll just finish with Bob Marley. And Bob Marley, if you know any of his music, one of the lines to some of his music is, "A hungry mob is an angry mob." And as we look around the world, we talked about political discourse earlier, not discourse, political discord earlier. And the climate and food and shelter migration, when you look at most refugees of the world, it's often caused by the changes happening in the climate. And as there's more and more pressure of one population moving to another place and demanding the resources fundamentally of food, we will see more, unfortunately, potentially violent challenges. And so feeding ourselves is the most rooted part of our community. And I think Karen talked about the mycelium and how we're so interconnected with our tendrils and connecting around food. If we look at culture and history, food is where we break bread together. It's in almost every religion, it's in every community, it's in every culture. And where we sit and we honor our elders and their knowledge, as Joseph opened up with the land acknowledgement. Why is it that we are so dismissive of the elders' knowledge in these days when there are cultures and elders with such deep knowledge, and we have to blend the new ideas and the old knowledge for our future? So that's my ramble, and now we can go to conversation, I suppose.
Well done, David. Well done. Okay. I have a question. I think we could go around, but Michelle, you've been looking through the questions?
Yep, I'll float one or two, and then we had a couple that were sent in too. So
Okay.
Jeannie wants to, and I think this is probably directed mostly at Karen, regarding school and student-run gardens and programs. Who takes care of the gardens through the summer? You know, when the students, and I know this is I know that from personal experience, this is a challenge for many school gardens. So how do you address that, the care and maintenance of gardens when students aren't available?
Yeah, it's a great question and a very common need. So we are fortunate in that our program is really separate from the school. We're like a complete entity unto ourselves as a nonprofit. So the kids know when they sign up to be a part of Change the World Kids that they're going to be gardening over the summer. So it's kind of part of our program. We have like about 2 work parties a week where we're weeding and harvesting, and we have a weekly harvest schedule and the crew. So that's just fortunate for us that not everyone is into gardening. We get, you know, artists and, you know, all different types. But I know that I also have worked with a lot of school programs, and I really think that the key to engagement is finding a couple, not just one, but like 2 garden leads that can help each other and support each other in organizing work parties with families and like groups. And really that is the key to this community connectivity, is not just thinking in terms of like school calendar schedules, but in terms of, you know, well, how much food do we need to grow for this community? Oh, let's talk to the local food shelf and like establish a connection and say, oh, actually they need more tomatoes, and then have the goals be focused on, like when we started making connections with the Sharon food shelf, they straight up were like, we don't actually get a lot of fresh local tomatoes. And so we kind of decided that was going to be something we're going to grow in our new garden there. And so having that be the focus, and then saying, okay, let's grow tomatoes, and getting people geared up to doing that, as opposed to who's going to sign up for the watering schedule every 3rd day. And just little things like that, you know, I think helping to understand the impact of the growing, where the food is going, and getting people inspired to come out and be a part of that is just so essential. And I think organizing in teams is the best way to go. And I'm glad to talk about how to do that. But really, it takes some key people that love gardening and love doing it in the community, which isn't everyone. You know, a lot of gardeners, and sometimes myself, you know, it's a peaceful sanctuary place, and it's like, it's a place where I don't want to have my community, which is all good. And there's a place for everyone. So I think, and connecting with those people that would appreciate the land access and things like that, just getting creative about it is just essential.
Great. Michelle, do you have another?
And then another one from Fred, kind of more along the lines of maybe solutions for some of the climate change, you know, in growing some food. So, you know, are there strategies each of you have used or had success with in landscape modifications, and just kind of like dealing with those direct consequences?
So let's go through everybody. Sam?
Landscape modifications. I live in Burlington, and I think the biggest landscape modification we can do to help feed each other is converting lawn to garden. Like Dave says, the big caveat is that so much of our food comes from very far away, and what we can produce here by converting the lawns of Burlington into garden is supplemental, but I think it's a huge landscape modification, both in the producing food and in the creating a ecosystem that humans and non-humans want to live in. Like, so many of different indicators of ecological health get better when we turn lawns into gardens. There's bugs and birds.
Meg?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Fred. We have in fact made quite a few modifications at the South Welton Community Garden to better prepare for the climate emergency. And so for just a tiny bit of background, before myself and these two other women took over management of the garden, there was a community garden space there. It was pretty much entirely overgrown with weeds, and it was really just those two elders having their own plots. And every spring, the farm that is right down the road from the community garden came with their tractor and plowed the land. And then it was just private plots only, most of which sat empty the whole year. And I provide that background because, one of the first things we decided when we turned this into a community resource of having communal gardening space, one of the first things we decided was, okay, we don't want that tractor anymore. Not that, we love that farmer and that farm very much. They're a very close partner for us, but we didn't feel the need to have the tractor come down the road from the farm and plow all this land and go back. We decided, we can build up a team and prepare the beds by hand. And so a few of the modifications we've made, we really have eliminated fossil fuel use where there was a tiny bit before. We've eliminated it. We've implemented all of these practices that allowed us to register as a climate victory garden. So again, just, planting cover crops is so important, and we make sure that all of our plots are covered before the snow comes, that we don't let any soil just sit bare. So we cover crop, we rotate, how David was talking about, we rotate where we're planting what, which is also really important for the nutrient cycles and building up soil. We do composting of we compost weeds separately from crop surpluses. And we also take all of the cardboard from, not all, we take most of the cardboard from our local businesses. So, downtown South Welton, if you've ever been there, it's a strip of businesses. The back end of those businesses is an alley full of cardboard boxes. And we take all of those cardboard boxes from our local businesses and use them to lay down under mulch and all of that stuff. So any opportunity we have pretty much to take carbon that's out there and bring it back into the garden and back into the soil, we are doing. And we have noticed just since 2018, we've noticed a huge change in the quality of our soil and the amount of pollinators that are there. We saw butterflies for the first time last season. We can visibly see it becoming a more healthy ecosystem by implementing all of these regenerative practices that were not present before. So that's really important at the very micro level to someone's individual garden, all the way up to the big farm level. Yeah.
Thank you, Meg. Karen?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think a lot about it. And actually, I'm going to switch my hats to my permaculture solutions. I've been practicing permaculture for a long time, and was introduced to it in the Pacific Northwest, actually. And Sam and I were just commiserating around our connection to Western Washington University, and there's a great little haven there where there's a 5-acre permaculture garden, and I got to really start exploring some of these concepts and have been studying and practicing them since. And so this applies to like landscape forms and farms as how we are kind of thinking in terms of creating ecosystem functions, not just growing food for annual vegetable production, but farms as ecosystems and as by dynamic living the systems that they are. So I work in the regeneration core capacity, connecting youth to farms that are practicing regenerative ag practices. So a lot of what's already been spoken about in terms of cover crops, crop rotation, but also agroforestry. So intercropping and alley cropping. So this is mixing more perennials and shrub layers into annual market gardens for the obvious benefit of diversification, both above and below ground, but also for the ecosystem functions that they provide in terms of clean water, recycling, clean soil, ultimately more rain and precipitation. And so I think this is a lot of what we are trying to kind of connect, help students get place-based experiential education on farms that are practicing these practices to really learn, how to adapt to the climate changes. And I think anytime that we're talking about growing systems for food systems, we have to be thinking in terms of agroforestry and also perennializing our food crops. So, and not just for diversity and nutrient density, which are also major factors, but for the ways that most gardeners know that if you have perennials and annuals growing together, you really need to water less. Like those longer tap roots are helping to bring up minerals and water to the surface for other plants to be able to access. So we're just building in those ecological systems and really starting to mimic the patterns of nature. And to me, in that processing of mimicking, we're growing for also nutrient density and productivity. So we're now in the category of multi-solving, which is this great term that Climate Interactive is using to kind of help us all think about multi-solving strategies towards climate mitigation, and which includes obviously soil building, sequestering carbon, increasing biodiversity, cleaning water. We can see all these benefits. So the farmers that I know that are integrating these practices need to be supported. These are practices that are not always, they're not marketable, billable hours. And so there's some legislation in Vermont being passed. I'm not an expert in this, but I know that we all need to get behind, and David, you might know more, you can chime in, but supporting farmers, ecosystem services, like getting farmers paid for ecosystem services, and recognizing the ecological benefit to that and how important it is to our survival here. Anyway, I could go on and on about these topics, but hopefully that helps a little bit understanding like some practices. And feel free to get in touch if you want to be connected to some of the farms that are really utilizing regenerative agricultural practices so that you can support them and buy their food and support them at farmers markets and all that, because there is a great movement happening, and a lot of it is happening right here in Vermont. So we're very fortunate.
Thank you, Karen. David.
Yeah, and I would add on the regenerative side that there's a combination of regenerative and organic, because there's some farms out there that are doing regenerative work. I had a very large LFO dairy farm reach out to me a couple of years ago and say, we've been looking at our nutrient management plan for years for nitrogen and phosphorus. And I just realized we've increased our organic matter by 1% in the last 10 years, which for anybody who knows, that's actually a huge increase to increase organic matter that fast, because they grow cover crops in the fall and then they grow their GMO glyphosate resistant corn, and then when the cover corn comes up, they spray the cover crop to kill it. And so the biodiversity of their soil and a lot of other factors. So hope you don't mind me, Karen, sort of going a little deeper on that regenerative bit, because there's some greenwashing out there, and so people need to kind of know all of that. But I would say cover crops are a huge piece of climate mitigation, because you're sequestering carbon, you're holding your soil in place. I will certainly admit, as a larger vegetable farm with cultivation equipment, it's tricky. Thank you, April. And so there's this real challenge for me. I'm battling with myself all the time of like using equipment and growing this kind of volume of food, but then trying to make it a more affordable price for folks that are more financially challenged to have access to healthy, local, organic food. So, one of the things you do as community gardens, and a lot of you talked about it, is donating food, and we do as well. I mean, we've donated, I think last year, almost 15,000 pounds of food to the food shelves and to food distribution events where we're handing out to cars, during the pandemic. But it's not easy to do all aspects right. And I think it's more manageable in many ways at community gardens where you've got volunteers coming in, and I really value that. So join your community gardens and help them get bigger. I would say for those with lawns, if you're not going to convert it to food, as Sam just talked about, let your lawn grow longer. Lawns don't have to be 1 inch. If you grow your lawns longer, the roots will actually go deeper commensurately. And also you will gather more organic matter. So when you also do mow it, if you mow it and you don't have a grazing ruminant to mow it, then the bits will stay longer and will compost into the soil better if they've got some cover over them, if you let it grow longer, including weeds. Don't worry about some weeds in your garden, in your lawn. It doesn't have to be a perfect grass garden. I would say going back to one thing I said earlier, which is the buy local now, so you'll have local later. I mean, if you want resiliency, if you support your farms, and that's not just mine, there's hundreds of them all over the state as well, thousands, then they will get used to producing a larger volume so that if the hits the fan, the food doesn't just grow overnight. So if in November we've put food up, that's the amount we've put up because that's what our demand has been through the winter sales at the markets, at the stores. So the more buying local, not that I'm probably preaching to convert it here on this discussion, but talking with friends and others about where do you put your resources and how do we make all of this food more accessible? I've been really inspired by Meg and Karen talking about their community gardens efforts and work to broaden who is getting the food, because many of us are in a privileged position to either have the time or the ability to do community gardening or to buy local food, which is more expensive. And so supporting those efforts to make that food more accessible to a broader part of the population, both directly as food, but also through the community opportunities of things like community gardens, I think is really important.
I have a kind of a question. I know we're winding down here according to my clock, but my question, curious, it may not even fit here. It does fit, is how do we bring others into this conversation? I'm very inspired by our panel tonight. And what's your thoughts, strategies on bringing in another friend, another neighbor, somebody who hasn't been involved, who maybe hasn't been thinking like us? What's some thoughts on growing this movement?
The first thing I would do is make them a meal with local food.
Great.
Get to their mind and their heart through their stomach. And then they'll say, whoa, and then have the conversation over food. I think having a conversation over food is one of the best ways on any number of issues. Beautiful.
Yeah, I would echo that, making meals and expand it to, turn this stuff into community celebrations. In general. So, at the community garden, we turned a large section of land that was actually not part of the community garden before into a sweet potato plot, and had hundreds of pounds of sweet potatoes to harvest, which is a lot if there's just 2 or 3 of us showing up. But we made it a big fun community event and put out the information and said, hey, come, anyone at all, come to the garden at this time, harvest sweet potatoes. Everyone's going to get to take home a box, and we're going to bring you coffee and some other refreshments and hang out at the garden and harvest. And people who we haven't ever seen at the garden before showed up because, they just wanted to check out what was going on and socialize with their neighbors. And so the more we can tone this stuff into celebratory community events, the better. And I will also say I'm really excited to kind of transition back out of the Zoom world. It has been really great for some things and has increased access in some aspects. And it is also a big barrier for a lot of people. And, you know, I think the majority of folks would rather maybe go to a panel in person where there's meals and food provided than, you know, sit on a virtual panel in their evening. And I just can't wait for us to kind of get back to the 3D, the flesh dimension.
Karen, you want to take a quick shot, and Sam, a quick shot? How do we bring more people in? We're down to about a minute. Maybe very hard.
Just real quick, I think the thread that I really want to kind of capstone on is just that piece of celebration and joy again. You know, like what we're faced with, and this isn't about burying or hiding the fact that there's war going on and collapse ahead of us. It's about finding joy in places of resilience. And I think when we do it from that place and we're making good meals and the smells are wafting throughout the community and people are coming together, it's a very attractive place, really. And it comes from those places within us. So, you know, we have to live into that as much as we can and support each other in all the ways that we can, and getting to those and making sure that we're always asking ourselves who's not here and why aren't they here and are they okay, basically. And if we can carry that ethic forward, then I think that there's something there that we can all find our place in. So.
Great. And Sam, we're going to have to get to you next time. I want to thank our great panel here, Sam Bliss, Meg Fuerst. Is that close enough? First. Good. Karen Ganey, and of course, David Zuckerman. Thank you all so much. Next week, coming attractions, our panel will be focused on floods, frost, and fungus. Kat Buxton, Ann Hazelrig, and Charlie Nardozzi. So please stay tuned. We will be surveying all the people who are coming to these to get feedback and see what we might do next. But this was really very informative, very inspiring, and very joyful. So thank you all for being here tonight. Michelle, any last closing words for you?
No, I just wanted to recognize that we didn't get to many of the questions on the chat. And so we'll try to distribute those and get those answers out to folks.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good evening.